Hello boys and girls. I would like to tell you that I've made a few corrections to my motor and some repairs. Yesterday I went for a record of 1000 volts and my motor nobly broke down when it hit 800 volts. So it's got a bit of a balance issue, so I've had to bolt it down. But the purpose of this video is to very quickly describe a few issues, what I've been experiencing and what went wrong. Just get it fired up for the duration. Now, I had a hypothesis that my power supply was causing problems, but I found that unlikely. Basically, the power supply can put out 180 milliamps and about 1100 volts, and I can simply put a screwdriver across the terminals and sparks will fly everywhere and it will be absolutely fine. The power supply is virtually indestructible, so as predicted, that wasn't the problem. Secondly, I went to the H-bridge circuit, and I'm going to tell you what's going on with that here. Well, for viewers of my video, they will be perfectly well aware that that the input of the electricity looks like that. That's what I'm driving into it, and then the motor itself produces electricity, which looks like that. So the deal here is that the input matters. This is important, and what we've got here, these bits here that the motor is producing, they don't matter. What matters is the overlapping bits, all of this stuff here, because I'm putting in 800 volts, which is the square, and as the magnet comes around, it goes up and it produces up to 1000 volts. So what that's doing is like having a second power supply. I'm putting in 800 volts, and then for a tiny bit of the cycle there, my motor increases the output to 1000 volts. This is of course why the engine runs so efficiently. But the problem is, here's the motor. The switches only go, they're only supposed to, power is only supposed to be delivered in a single direction. However, when it goes above, the power is actually going in reverse because it's trying to charge my power supply. So that's why I have these diodes here. When I first started experimenting with the Newman motor, basically all my components were failing by the time I got to 200 volts. That's because the power from the motor was coming up and blowing the transistors. The minute I put these diodes in, my maximum voltage went up to 600 volts before I started having problems. And then I started having to look at other things, like the way I was driving the bases of the transistors and putting in diodes in places such as this. The base of all the transistors now have diodes. So that brings us to the current events. I suspected that because what happened here is when I gripped the shaft, several seconds after I gripped the shaft, that was when the failure occurred. So as I grip the shaft, it drains the input capacitors and lowers the input voltage, and this bit here is proportional to the RPM, so they were both lowered together. But I suspect it could have changed the ratio, so instead of there being a 200 volt differential being fed into the power supply, that may have gone up to 250 volts under my heavy loading, and yeah, so it was feeding more power back in through the transistors, and that blew the transistors. That's one theory. So what I attempted to do was these 4 diodes here, I doubled them. There's now 2 diodes in all those positions. Now that didn't work. That was the first thing I tried. That didn't work. That reduced the total output, or that reduced the voltage it was able to get up to by about 10 volts. So instead of my maximum being sort of, yeah, anyway, it brought it down to about 780 volts before I started encountering problems. So then I replaced these 4, and that brought it down again. That brought my voltage before problems down to about 770. And then I thought, oh dear, well there's not much left. But I do have a 1.2 microfarad microwave capacitor across there to sort of to take the edge off these things, to take the edge off my squares. So my squares no longer look like squares. Technically speaking, they look a bit like that, and that will prevent EMF spikes such as that blowing my my transistors. So instead of the 1 microfarad, I replaced that with a 0.001 microfarad, which is a bit risky, but I had to do it to try it, and that didn't work either. So I can't figure out why, when I turn this 1000 volt power supply up to 1000 volts, the motor ignores it, and it will not climb beyond 800 volts. In fact, the current, the ammeter, climbs slightly, but it doesn't seem to climb enough to justify the wastage. It's like the current isn't being wasted, it's not being shorted above that point, it's just ineffectual. So you would think if it hits 800 volts and then hits a diode, anything above 800 volts will just count as a short, and that would increase the current considerably, but that's not occurring. It does appear to be cancelled out by these peaks. So we're running out of hypotheses here. So I'm reaching out. There's a call for help going out. Does anyone know why, if I put 1000 volts into this motor, it completely ignores me and it only takes 800? A bit of a mystery. So I'm going to keep pondering the possibilities. Obviously there are a few. My next plan of attack is to eliminate all of this drive circuitry from the list of possibilities, and the way I've done that is, also I want to say that the way I got it from 600 volts to 800 volts and circumvented those problems was to replace the Darlingtons. These aren't Darlingtons, they're not using common collectors. The power for all the collectors to emitters is coming from those 4 separate mains isolation transformers. So yeah, that's the reason for the 4 transformers, because using common collectors just wasn't going to work. It just doesn't do the job. Now I'll attach a diagram at the end of the video, an exact schematic, to show you just what that looks like. But yeah, the way I plan to solve this problem is by eliminating all this stuff to test it. Is I've created a tower of doom, and I'll show you that right now. Pardon me for just a moment. Here is my magical tower of doom. It's missing the usual scaffolding. Instead, mine's held together with hot glue. But what you have in here is 4 solar panels and 4 10-watt LEDs. And I found that this version of an opto-isolator is not quite powerful enough to drive the transistors full on, but it will provide about 50 milliamps, so it's nearly there. So I should be able to replace all of that with my, and it will work because I've already tested it, but I didn't test it with this application in mind. So it will work. I'll be able to eliminate all of that circuitry. And there was only one thing other that I wanted to make note of. That was, in this arrangement, obviously you've got your positive rail going through the transistor to there. So this is called a, or up here is probably, because I know what this is actually called. If you put a positive through a load and then switch it, that's called a positive collector, because you've got the load above the transistor, whereas in the H bridge, both here and here at the bottom, you've got the load above the positive, but up here the load is underneath the transistor, which you're not really supposed to do, technically speaking. I was taught not to do this when I studied electronics so many years ago, but in many instances with many transistors it can work, but there is a detriment. I've tested just 10 minutes ago all of these transistors individually, and I found that both the transistors that had the load above the transistor, so the way it should typically work, i.e. these bottom two, the ones that had the load above the transistor, were able to reach about 810 volts under testing, whereas the ones with the opposite way around, with the load below the transistor, they only reached about 790 volts before they started malfunctioning and limiting themselves, irrespective. The only thing that happens is when I turn the voltage on the power supply up beyond where it just starts ignoring me, the power supply starts humming a bit more loudly, and not, and the motor ignores me. So at this stage, I really hope no one watched this video, because it's very technical, but it does provide a bit of a light as to the problems I've had with this Newman machine. And these are just today's. I've had a few days such as this where I've had to try to figure out and subsequently solve a lot of different technical issues all in the same day, which were not covered when I studied. There is not a lot of fields in power electronics where you deal with these kind of voltages, especially not directly switching with transistors. But you'll be pleased to know I do have some extra transistors out there. I bought about 3 or 4 different varieties, which is pretty exciting. So if all those methods, this thing gets a bit warm, I still haven't heat sinked it. So if all those methods of fault finding don't work, I've got some extra transistors. So one way or another, we're going to get to the bottom of this. We're going to see this motor turn at 1000 volts. And we're going to load test it, and then we're going to make a bigger one. The stage is set, and frankly I would quite like to power my house off this. The quantity of torque that you can get from having a lever arm such as that isn't 9 centimeters long, cut down the middle. The length of my rotor is going to be 46 centimeters long, and every bit as efficient as my very first Newman motor with a lot more wire. So this thing's going to be dangerous. Not physically, not practically, but psychologically and sociologically dangerous. They're the best types of danger. I fucking love them. That's what I do. Come back to the carnage. I'd quite like to roll up with a university and one of these on the back of my trailer and film the results. I want to see some really, really angry people and some massive auric globes of magnificence from these very same people. Should be fun. Stay tuned. I promise I will film that. Okay. See you next time.